Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to another episode, and second in the series of
part two from
Lost Signals discusses philosophy. Once upon a time, this show was called Neophytes of Narratology. In our neophyte, even more pretentious phrase of, and at that point, we, in really our neophyte stage of critical analysis, we tackled one of the great works of critical theory.
Is a fucking legend, if you will.
Roland Barthes. S/Z. And perhaps we bit off a bit more than we could chew with that discussion, but we finally get to return to Barthes in our part two discussion on authorship versus art. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
And I like castration almost as much as I like Sarah seeing the story.
Stephen Ramosi.
I'm not going to follow that up with anything.
And Christopher Morgan.
Say hello, somebody.
Hey.
Hello, somebody.
So, again, this is, I think 4 years ago, we discussed SZ, which was, I've come to appreciate over time the concept of thematic braiding in works.
Like a fine French wine, yeah. So ages Barthes' work.
Yes. I suppose so. Stephen, Scott, and myself read it. Chris did not read SZ. So this, I believe, is your first experience with Barthes?
To my knowledge, yeah.
But you have expressed that you've read Foucault and Derrida and things like that.
Yeah.
Which is very much in the tradition of it. Roland Barthes is a dense writer. This is a 6-page work that has a doctoral thesis
like
story in
pages,
there.
Really, yeah.
But I suppose I'll go off with, because if you're here listening to this, you're likely want someone to tell you what this is about versus instead of reading it yourself. It starts off with a discussion of when a character in a work or when a narrator in a work says something, whose voice are they speaking with? Is it the character themselves? Yeah, is the character themselves? Is it the author, or is it something beyond that? And that's the framework he proceeds for the rest of this work with. He then goes into the relationship of the author and the work, and how at the time that he was writing this, or in modernist tradition, there has been an attribution of the individual's importance in work. And this was kind of a postmodern look at saying that the author is actually probably the least important aspect of art. It is the individual who reads it. And he goes on to kind of amusing, and these concepts would be further expanded upon in SC. But I just wanted to give a brief overview of what the work is about. And then, as we usually do with these kind of things, general impressions going forward. So, Scott, would you like to start with this?
Certainly, yeah. So, like you said, I was familiar with Barthes because of SC specifically, and that certainly, and I think it's like not funny, but like at least pertinent that we've seemed to bring at least a concept or two of his from SC specifically, which he sort of like, it's like very vaguely introduced in Death of the Artist or Death of the Author. Yes. So like it, and I feel as if we collectively then have used it more, as you said, more often, like more as we went on, as considering ourselves, quote unquote professional, or at least, well-versed critics in a sense. So yeah, so like because of that, I guess, because of like my familiarity with Barthes beforehand, this was to me like an easier read, even though like that is a relative way to describe his stuff in his essays and so forth in general. But I think the points he raised, which we'll elaborate upon, like do resonate still to this day, and perhaps maybe more so than even he realized at the time. So yeah, I think that like, and this is again like as you mentioned, sort of a vaguely like not a vague like kind of a part 2 follow up to our episode where we did art versus the artist a couple weeks back, like at this point at the date of this recording. So it sort of like goes hand in hand. And you had read it and mentioned it on that episode, but now we're doing specifically like it itself. And yeah, certainly we're going to bring up things from it. But just to answer your question, I did enjoy this little essay. It introduces its ideas in a accessible enough manner. And I think, like I said, I think those ideas do stand, and there's something to be more than a few things to be dug into there to more deeply look into. So yeah, I enjoyed it, and we're about to flesh it out. But that was my impression. So, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He puts forth this notion of the author not being important, and perhaps a reader is the most important aspect of the whole relationship of the way that a work of art is consumed, I guess. And I don't find myself like completely agreeing with him, but he does make a lot of good points in here. And, it seems like that was the ultimate thing that he really wanted to say in these 6 pages. And he does kind of pontificate upon kind of how he gets there, I guess. And it's interesting to see that. And you're right, like reading this now as opposed to when we read SZ 5 years ago almost, if not more,
Between 4 and 5
is I view it in a different way. And perhaps that's also because it's not an entire book about one short story. But
of which the work is longer than the actual original analysis that he's
doing. Exactly. But it feels like some of our long discussions on a TV show or something. But it does feel like it does feel like the same type of writing, but I feel a little bit more comfortable with it now than I perhaps was then.
That's pretty much what I was also saying.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Well, if I may, we've both consumed more narrative theory over the years, but we've also become versed in the art itself.
Yeah.
So I think that the comfort comes with experience.
And not only that, but we've had conversations about this very topic and talked it over, and that certainly helps with getting where he's coming from too. So yeah, there is that all that stuff, that new history that we have as opposed to the last time we tried to read them. But yeah, so that's my first impression. Chris, I don't know if you want to share yours.
Yeah, it's been where I read when had I read this back, when I was getting my bachelor's degree, this would have been like 6 pages. So I'm out of kind of like the habit, which is why I'm trying to get more on these philosophy things, because I'm kind of out of the habit of reading academics, because there's a certain amount of references that he makes that there are some disconnects. Like I feel like I really absorbed everything, but I felt like I got a bunch of puzzle pieces together. And it's like you brought up Foucault. I keep bringing up Foucault because believe it or not, it was I know you're not going to believe this with Foucault, but it was a pretty dense, fairly long essay.
I believe you.
What?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I had become so adjusted to reading academic papers that I could then write a paper on that, comparing it to a lesser paper, which my English professor said, right? Don't write like Foucault, but use his thought process, not like this nickel and dime guy. So there's a lot of ideas in here. I feel like I said before, I feel like I walked in the middle of a conversation because some of the references
art can often feel like that. Like, yeah, for sure. That's I like that description, Chris.
I mean, like I said, so I wasn't familiar with a lot of these references, but when I was looking it back after I read it and I was skimming it before the podcast, I'm catching little sentences, and with you guys fleshing out parts of it, it's starting to gel.
So weirdly, I'm going to talk about, because this is off the point you're saying is, I was in grad school I may be returning to grad school soon as well. But part of it is who's your audience when you're writing. And that's an interesting aspect of the combination of author to audience, because you're right. Bart isn't writing this for the layman. This is a conversation with other academics.
Yeah, academic with a capital E.
It's fascinating to discuss his work almost meta, like, because he's discussing that the author, it's more about the reader than the author,
And
but
he
in
falls
his is that
into his
he's
own trap of it.
constructing a work purpose of being consumed by a small population. I think so. I just thought that was a curiosity.
And the interesting thing about it is, like, he's talking about the death of the author while he's creating a work as an author
Yeah.
Like,
about
specifically
something that
voiced
is
by
clearly
him.
like personal to him, like as an author. Like,
No,
Yeah.
which was funny reading this, because that is one thing. By the time I got to page 4 of this, I'm like, I'm getting the meta aspect of that loud and fucking clear.
Yeah, so like, I mean, that always to me like the most perfectly like French like highfalutin kind of thing to do. Like, you know, like he almost defeats his own point, but he by nature of it, he has to do that, like, because it's the very nature of the thing that he's trying to convey to us at the audience that he's intending it for.
So there's a lot of ideas here. So I'm going to introduce one and we can discuss it. And I think it goes back to his concept of the braid from SZ. I think that's what I'm most comfortable talking with.
Quite a bit, yes.
But the idea that a work, when created, is not solely a creation of an individual. It carries with it centuries of precedent involved with it. This idea, there's nothing new in the world. It's all built upon concepts that existed beforehand, and that the author is only a translator of concepts that exist out in the world, built upon that. And to a certain extent, that is true. But there are better story. Like, if we're all telling the same story slightly differently, there are better storytellers than other ones. So
well, perhaps only because the world has made them into that, and you could go back forever on that kind of thing.
It's almost kind of recursive, but yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, I'll just address that specific thing real quick. Yeah, he doesn't. I don't think he uses this phrase in the essay, but I'll try to paraphrase it. Like, it's almost as if the author, if you will, is a conduit to convey these ideas, while not being like the be-all end-all originator of them, right? So it's like, yeah, so like, yeah, it might like vary, of course, like the skill level, if you will, might waver, but this like the core idea and/or story and/or etc., whatever, like the text, we'll call it in this point, as he does, right? That is being conveyed to the audience, to whomever that may be, like, which is also a broadly like can be defined in various ways. Nevertheless, though, like, it doesn't necessarily change all that much the interpretation of it, right? The interpretation both from the author street, from the producer street, if you will, and to the receiver street. That is the thing that like sort of is transient, if you will. So yeah, I mean, that's I think one of his major points, and I don't disagree with that, at least not fully. So I think that does stand. I think that sort of is the case in humanity, and especially of the telling of tales and stories, etc. So,
because once you put art out there, it ceases to be yours. So talking from a meta aspect and talking about, it's just like, I felt like I came in the middle of a conversation because this thing wasn't for me. You were just talking about things like, okay, we're building upon different themes, but how the theme is packaged might speak to you one way or another.
Yep.
A couple years ago, I did some music for a project that fell through, and I was asked to create a narrative, but where I would put things and the person interpreted it differently. So I think that kind of awoke that instance woke me up to the fact that once you put art out there, it's no longer yours. You are subject to you're subject to the bias of it. I mean, as we discussed last time, you have probably one of the most gorgeous pieces of music written, the prelude to Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, who is a horrible person. But at that point, you put the art out there, and it develops its own meaning. and who the fuck know? I mean, he wrote it probably for himself, he was, but I just felt, I mean, what we're speaking conceptually about, if I'm getting there, is I'm gonna stop talking there because I think I made my point.
No, like I get it. Like you're right. Like it does go back. Like we can't help but we're gonna have to reference some things from that episode because they go hand in hand. And you're right. Like I think one of, if not Bart's major point in this essay, and as raised previously as well, is like, yeah, like you said, Chris, once a piece of art is produced and is consumed or at least viewed, etc., taken in by others, then it ceases to belong to the original creator, right? It becomes its own, like it exists in its own sphere and space, as Barth, I think, actually does say that. And yeah, I think that certainly is true. Like that might be one of the big pillars that has always existed since humans as a species have fucking produced art. So like, yeah.
I think he's even going farther than that. Actually, I think he's saying that the author needs to be completely wiped away. Like not even that it doesn't belong to them, but they don't have anything to do with it. In fact, they're completely. I mean, the idea, the death of the author, right? And like the final sentence of this really nails it home, where it says the birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author. And the entire idea that it's pretty fucking badass. But I don't know if I completely agree with that. I think that the author has a lot to do with the art that is created, whether or not you as a reader want to acknowledge that as a different thing, I suppose, or watcher or whatever.
Well, the idea of the author as a translator of ideas is fascinating to me. Well, just to be a little bit, if I translated work from German, or I think he uses an example from Greece here, by no means do I get to claim authorship of original ideas there. All I did was take concepts, craft it in a new language and presenting it. Granted, you might say that if I did like Mein Kampf to give it to an English audience, like there's intent there that I'm guilty for. But you laugh there. But that was for the point of it, is that the idea is that there is a removal of whereas the author, all that is him or her representing the ideas of the zeitgeist of the moment, everything that led to the production of this idea, and this is an imperfect translation of the thoughts in their head in order to produce a to kind of translate those ideas.
Of society, I guess, something like that.
Yeah. But more to that point, though, is I was talking to Scott this earlier today that anyone can produce art, but whether art is elevated in a culture or not is dependent upon those who are consuming that art. So it's any piece is, and there's different groups within a society that elevate different pieces of art. There is a reason. There's always been kind of a art of the people and art of higher, those who feel themselves higher society, and oftentimes they're at conflict. I don't like the comedy of Larry the Cable Guy, but you cannot deny that he's more effective than
portion of the audience.
And go on, but just one the wrap up this idea is that it is the readers, the culture of the readers who are giving, who are validation of the art. So the artist is not as important as the readers responding to their art.
The reason I laughed when you said Mein Kampf was because when you started talking, the first thing that crossed my mind, ironically enough, is Baz Luhrmann. And I think in Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, or Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, like because Shakespeare's a great example of that, because you have the author Shakespeare, but then you've got interpretations, as you said, building to a certain audience, something about the zeitgeist that moves in that, okay, this interpretation speaks to you, whereas this one might not. I mean, Shakespeare's replete with that. And like I said, and I know I get attacked all the time from Scott and Beth for not liking that. And I said I'd give it another shot, but I think Shakespeare is a great illustration of that, because after a while we all know Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet, Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, which I adored. His complete 4-hour thing.
I do like that version as well. So I'll give. Oh,
yeah. So it's just like we know Shakespeare is so embedded into these stories that no longer is when the art's reproduced, is it his? It's now Baz Luhrmann's or Kenneth Branagh's or Franco Zeffirelli's.
So two things, Chris. Juliet on her balcony. That's Tanagra, of course. But anyways, like no. So I want to go back to something else, because again, I can't help it that I feel as if, and I brought this up in the previous episode on the Art versus Artist, where I think I purport to you guys and the audience as well that there can be a scale of which, like, okay, in this case, perhaps the author / producer of X piece of art is more sort of inextricably linked to it, whereas and then as the scale goes on, then they're more like the creators, if you will, are more removed from it, and it belongs more to the audience or the zeitgeist, as you said, like the populace at large, where like so many hands have touched it, or it's so ingrained anyway. Like also similar to what you said, Chris, these things, X things, are so ingrained that like nobody can no longer can there be claimed an ownership, if you will, in that sense over them. But there can be some cases in which like it goes back also to the thing we talk about a lot, where the intent of the creator of a given piece of art, right, might in certain circumstances be given more consideration than others, depending on context, of course, at large, always. But I'm just saying, like, to me, there's going to be a scale, or at least that's how I view a lot of stuff, right? In general, especially even outside of the podcast, and especially within it when we're, critiquing, evaluating, etc. That in this case, then, it's more, there's more of a linkage between creator and piece of art, and then it might expand and might get looser and looser in other circumstances. So it's like, of course, to me, like sort of a flowing graph, if you will, right? Scale, as I said, that there's no hard and set fast rule to decide, but again, take it in context, sort of case by case basis, and then you can decide whether or not, as an audience, like how much weight you should give to the sponsorship, if you will, or ownership, etc., authorship of it, versus it being a piece of art unto itself removed from the creator.
Yeah, I mean, I surely agree with that. I think that there is, and we talked about this on the first episode about this a couple weeks ago, where I think that it absolutely is somewhat dependent on, what the work is and what the author's intentions are for it. But you are right, Ian, like all that ceases to matter kind of if the audience doesn't find it or isn't interested in that.
Yeah, it becomes less relevant. Yeah.
So like to Bart himself, this is everything he's saying is absolutely right, because that's how he views the things that he reads. So, it doesn't matter in terms of him being the reader, but if you look at the world as, whoever's taking that content and reading it or watching it or whatever, then I think by his logic, it really depends on the way that the writer or the reader views it, or the consumer views it,
Yeah.
So there you go. So if you think that, you're right, Scott, and if Bart thinks this, he's right. And
I mean, certainly both viewpoints can be valid to an extent. Like there's no truth. Like he even says, like what fall into is that, like, if we can drill down deep enough to this work and know enough facts about the producer of it, then we can arrive at like, here is the actual truth / theme, etc. Like, this is what this work means for sure, 100%. No more argument. We're done. Like, case closed, essentially, right? Where it's a lot more nebulous and a lot more gray area because of that, like because of a lot of the things you just said, Steve-O. And I largely agree with that as well, with Bart's like his reasoning there, and with I think that just how it has shaken down, if you will, again in human history, put as broadly as possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're called clueless weasels too.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're clueless weasels. Other people think you're spot on. You're international assassin critics or whatever.
Oh yeah. It's true. But the point I wanted to make, which I'm stalling for time for the gather my thoughts on this. All right, one thing is we've hit a number of different styles as we proceed this. One thing we do is the AFI, which gives us the ability to do retrospectives on works that don't necessarily hold up to the standards of modern day. The Searcher is being a good example of that. While at the time it was considered a forefront, is it still valid in the cultural context of today? And that's where Barthes is important. Other things is we're looking at works where we're part of the fandom. So then we feel sort of an ownership of the works and we can judge that.
Those arts.
But I think today we did The Sound of Metal, which when we were doing the review of that, I suggested that it was important for me to find out how the deaf community felt about this work because it was trying to represent that.
Because it depicts
So it's interesting if you have to take the personal responsibility of the reader onto a work and divorce intent and I think that's part of the interesting thing of being a critic, where Barthes said that the critic, they feel it's their role to solve a work. It's interesting how, at least what I've been having to do is my criticism is look at a work through the context of whether it meets the current culture that it fits. And if I don't belong in that culture, such as the Sound of Metal, what people within that culture view of it.
Of course.
And I think that's very Barthian.
Sorry, yes, to add on to that, I think it's a very important point or a consideration to keep in mind because, if you're not if you're not part intrinsic to XYZ community, right, and you're just addresses concerns of that community, etc., viewpoint, populist portion of the people, then and we say this too, sometimes that means you have to be like, I'm not qualified per se necessarily to here's my interpretation of it, but because I am not within, again, X, whatever it might be, then, take that as well in consideration. So whatever my critique, analysis, etc. of it might be, it's just that might have a more personal connection to it, which might validate it more versus not being center part of that, right? So again, it's really funny to me, and it's somewhat Barthian braid itself. There's a number of things that you can bring to analyzing / considering, etc., discussing a piece of art, and again, almost to me at least, by a case by case context. That okay, in this one, then we do have to look at the life surrounding circumstances, etc., of the producer of this art. In other cases, like you said, Steve and Chris, it could just be completely moot. It doesn't matter whether or not, and perhaps that might be the case. Eventually, that becomes the case, anyways, right? On a long enough timeline, if you will.
Yeah. I agree.
the thing I like about the way we do critiques is the framework is the narrative. So it is possible to give a low narrative score to a movie you love and a high narrative score to a movie you hate. But it is kind of having this
scale, of course, buddy.
What'd you say?
That's why we tried to invent their own scale to account for that.
Right, but that's what makes the discussions interesting. Because we are taking somebody else's art. Like Ian, I cannot fucking believe I did not look up the reactions to the deaf community because not having representation, not actually having somebody on the autistic spectrum play a person who's autistic, or a trans person play somebody who's trans, or etc. Yeah. It's really interesting. I can't believe I didn't think that, but when we were discussing it narratively, it's just yes, that has to be consideration because you might
in this case
you're trying to make a wide appeal from it, but you are dealing with a portion of the population that has experiences that nobody else does. Mm-hmm. And you have to convey those experiences, even if you're not part of that community. and have everybody understand it.
Mhm.
Yeah, certainly, that's really well stated, Chris. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it can be like that's. I think the point I was trying to make, or I'll rephrase it, like that can be a very muddy, murky area to try to tread, like that line, to try to like stay upon it without going one way or another, doing justice to one side, but also making accessible enough, to ostensibly be consumed by portions of the populace who are not part of the one that is being depicted.
So this is going off topic slightly. I remember taking a critique class back in college, and they were discussing the different ways you can analyze a work. And some of you may have done this similar type of thing, but I tend to, because my personal thing is I look at that through economics often. I look at the Marxist socialist
Class wars are everywhere in your eyes.
No war but class war. But like that is my prominent framework. But I at least attempt to understand that there's always a feminist interpretation of a work. There's always a historical. There's a bunch of different ways of that thread, and it's what thread you as the critic tend to focus on. And I will admit to my bias that I look at works through the economic spectrum and how they affect class divisions and things like that. But I just, it's kind of like if you had a prominent way of viewing things, what do you think that yours are?
All right, that's a good question. Dracula, of course, as you like to say, is a class war. It's a treatise on classism. Sure. As in 1984. To me, I'm trying to think about it because I guess once upon a time, like earlier, I would have said something like, if they have cool references, like if a work references a previous work that I like as well, that's going to create a bias in my mind, and I'm going to give it a more positive spin, if you will, in my analysis. Nowadays, I guess it maybe goes back to what you said, like having doing this exact thing for 4 or 5 years at this point, I feel like I have honed my skills a bit, and at least to be able to remove the blinders I might have had previously to open it up. So I guess if a work is within a genre that I can't help but like intrinsically like was part of my formative years, I guess like that's something I'll give a pass to in a sense, or like I probably will be more lenient to it. Now I'm not looking like the class war thing. Like I don't think I have a similar like 1-to-1 ratio in the sense that you have seemingly for that.
Oh, I've noticed that I will reference a movie that almost has nothing to do with
Sure.
the implications of that aspect. But
No, I get it.
It's something I noticed of myself.
Yeah, no, like it's what I think it's a positive thing that you can acknowledge that and realize that, and when you apply it to things, you're like, okay, I'm viewing it towards this way, and this is sort of like my specialty in a sense, or at least something I gravitate towards mostly. So yeah, like to answer your question, and before I pass it on to you, gents, nowadays it's more like, is it a genre or like a broad style? Like I guess the source material. Mank is a really good one because we just did Mank. I did have quite an affinity for the source material, so like I knew I was going to have a more positive view of it in just the general analysis that we do of it, and that's going to hold true like always. I'll give one more example for a pass on. Not even like I'm playing fucking AC Valhalla right now. It takes place in Dark Age England, and that's just a period that I enjoy. I might possibly be enjoying this game more than I would have were it not for that specific thing, and the trap I often fall into. So like something like that.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. I don't really, I've been thinking about this. I don't really know. Like I guess the closest, I mean, I'm sure I have some kind of implicit bias that maybe I'm not fully cognizant of or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of what I tend to do when I'm going into watching something, be it like a movie or a TV show or reading a book even, is try to figure out what, goggles it wants me to put on, and then, try to get into the mode of watching it through the eyes of what the work wants me to, the way that the work wants me to
immerse yourself in the way it's trying to like sort of pull you in with, you're saying, I think.
Yeah. So, in that sense, I give a lot of rope to the, maybe not the, I was going to say the author, but maybe not the author, but the work itself, to tell me what it wants, how it wants to be watched or read or whatever. So yeah, I don't know.
This I kind of like it's really funny because again I think more Scott's point, it's more of a subjective thing, like superheroes. Like I always grew up loving Batman, but up until Batman Begins, I have never liked, aside from the animated series, an interpretation of Batman. And there's an example of one character being presented different kind of ways. How do you absorb it? I was thinking about, and I thought that was in like Marvel films, and they didn't gel for me until I saw Winter Soldier. But like, as we've talked about, like one of my favorite directors is Jim Jarmusch. And there was a film it is really interesting because he'll put things in there where you think you think he wants you to be on the side of the hero, but actually somebody else will be the comment on it. I'm like, no, this person is right. And there was a film that he put out where it really didn't gel with me. And then one line of dialogue, one word, it wasn't even a word, made the thing gel. And then we saw, so when I go into a Jarmusch movie, it's not really any one bias I have. It's a whole mix of things, which is why I tragically had to say I did not like The Dead Don't Die because because I went in there expecting with certain like I had these expectations, but not knowing what to expect because there is a lot of things he toys with, but I always am interested in the way he tells a story, whether like in Limits of Control, where it's mostly visual. There's very little dialogue in it. So I'm always interested in the way he's going to present a story, a message. And so, but when he bangs you over the head with it in a really sounds like a script he wrote in about 15 minutes,
I know. I just want to say that this is fascinating, especially the differences. Stephen, you're saying that you want to actively engage the work as you think the intent of you actively engaging the work is. While Chris, you're kind of saying that you go into a work judging it based on the effectiveness of the creator to almost a passive experience at how effective they are at and then the thing when I say active and passive, I don't necessarily I mean that like are they effective in delivering the message you think they want versus Stephen, you're saying more of I'm willing to put in the effort to. That's actually fascinating to me. I wonder now if I'm more of a passive or active because I do research when I approach a book to seeing. The last thing I want to talk about though is that I think that Barthes himself would suggest that historical and the culture that created a work at the time would be important for the braid. Concept. I think in SC he does actually mention that. Now, if that is part of the thematics, thematic analysis of a work is to look into the culture that gave a rise to that, and if the author is just a conduit to that culture, what's the difference then between the analysis of the author and analysis of the culture that brought around the author? And I don't think there is.
I think the line is super blurry. Like to answer the best I can, if that's the question we're talking about, yeah, I think it's an important consideration that Barthes brings up and is still resonant, literally right now again to the thing we're doing at this moment. And I think the answer is it's going to be, as we just talked out, a braid of subjectivity, a braid of like predisposed biases that you may or may not, as Steve was like, you may or may not have access to or be conscious of even, right? But I think it's still like going to be part of an aspect in which you're doing analysis and even which you're producing art. So like it's a fucking double-edged sword, and the sword is razor thin in a sense to that. So yeah, there's not an answer, but it's so blurry that allows them for a lot of interesting and valid interpretations of it on either end.
This may or may not be addressing your question directly, but I think thematically. In Glenn A. Larson created Battlestar Galactica, the original series in 1978. A lot of people thought it was like, oh, we're catching fire, we're rolling onto the whole Star Wars trend, right? But when Ronald D. Moore and David Icke were tasked with redeveloping it for a Sci-Fi Channel, and by the way, the original miniseries is a lot better than people give it credit for. I mean, so when
What
Ronald
about
D.
Star
Moore,
Trek? Never mind.
I purposely stayed away from that. But when Ronald D. Moore was tasked to write this after 9/11, 2 years after 9/11, the meaning behind all of a sudden you put this thing that everybody wrote off as a Star Wars clone. It's like, this thing is about an apocalyptic event, right? You realize that the story is about humanity being wiped out except for a handful of people that are the last of us surviving. So 9/11 informed his approach,
Sure.
The way we dealt with like idiot things like the Patriot Act, how those things could come to be, the different aspects of how we view a tragedy, so to speak, or a crisis. So, I mean, it's just interesting where, when I was growing up, this was a Star Wars knockoff, and all of a sudden now
The context changed hugely.
even going back to the original miniseries, back to the 1978 miniseries, my context has changed. I'm viewing it through different lenses now.
So to back up that thing, we did Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which I think is one of the most impressive works I've read in recent times.
God, yes.
Check that
But
episode out.
and I forget which one of you said this, but one of you did, saying that why isn't this more well known? The thing is, would you have read it if we weren't going through coronavirus? Would we have ever been in contact with this work?
Not.
Probably, honestly, probably not. We would have.
Likely not, sure.
And that's the thing is, it culturally and contextually to our lives became pertinent work.
It rose to the surface.
Read that work; it's phenomenal, and it's very prescient for our thing. But that's the thing is, like, it's. We now say, why wasn't it known? Well, we didn't know about it beforehand, and we only knew about it because our life has
happened to bubble to the surface.
Because
that event spurred it to. It is interesting that that we can reassess past works like Battlestar Galactica or Pale Horse, Pale Rider because through our current context,
right? But
visual lens.
But you cannot predict which ones are going to come. Like it's. I mean, by nature, that's how it happens.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
So, Ian, maybe it's been a while since you asked the original question, but were you were basically like asking what's the difference between analyzing the author and and analyzing the culture, and like how does the culture kind of stand in, I guess, for the author in terms of the way that things are analyzed. I think that you're right. I don't think there is much of a difference between if you're looking at it in that way. I don't think there is much of a difference in terms of that. And
like I said, Steve, the lines are super blurry. I think I think we're both agreeing upon that for sure.
But it is like really interesting that you guys bring up viewing these works through different cultures, because now, I mean, I guess that's why it's different, because culture changes, the author is still the same person, like maybe they change as a
more or
person,
less,
whatever, but like they're still that person named that thing or whatever, like.
Well, that's why we have a whole, even though I can't think of an example right now, think of like artists before their time.
Yeah.
Like culture had to catch up with their vision on things.
Right.
But that's
William Gibson shit.
It's interesting saying like any piece of art is looked at differently, when it's created, and then later they're looked at in two different contexts, right? The eyes that are looking at it are of a different people, of a different time, a different people. And so I don't know. That's one aspect of that. I don't know what the, certainly I don't think that there's a right answer to this question, but it is something interesting to talk about. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that.
So I have one last thought. Does anyone have anything that they want to talk about that I haven't mentioned yet?
Well, not today because Chris did a nice little teaser. I think the next, if we're calling this sort of a series, the next thing we're going to address is something he brought up. So I just want to say, nice segue. We'll focus more on a few things he brought up, but I don't think
characters that become universal beyond their creator. However, there's one last thing I want to say. Scott here likes to rant about The Last of Us. And it's a thing where I often all the vehemence that I'm like, is this the hill you want to die on?
It's one of the many hills I will choose to be hurt.
But it's fascinating is the way you describe it is that you're like, it's not a bad game, it's just not as good as ever. And your rant there reminds me of what Bart is doing. He is boldly declaring that the author doesn't matter, but I don't think he actually believes that. I just think he's like, guys, we got to stop focusing exclusively on the author. There's so much more going out here than just the author, because that is built off of what I last said. Is I think Bart would agree that there is his history in the context that a work was developed in is important for analysis, but that's not the end all and be all of it. And yeah, he's using very flowery language and very fiery language against this, but I think it's mostly for the Last of Us. It's important, but it's not the end all and be all. And I think that's
it's fine that it's there, but it's not that good.
Yeah. And I think that's that at least what I'm getting out of reading more Bart is just declaring of, guys, seriously, let's stop focusing exclusively on, and I respect that.
Yeah, I think that is a good cap off. That does stand. I don't disagree with it either. And I think it is part of, especially in this essay, and certainly even going by the essay, that's one of Bart's major points. And yeah, I think it's a good thing to a consideration to keep in mind. And, especially if you're doing work quote unquote, like this, like criticism, etc., analysis and so forth. So yeah, like, yes, it's important to keep that there, but it's, again, not the only thing to consider.
Well, The Last of Us critique of Bart.
If Roland Barthes was alive and he could have played Last of Us, I would love to see his fucking interpretation of it. That's my final thought for tonight.
Nice.
All right. Well, if no one has anything else to say, I'm Jonathan Manzer, here with Scott Thurlow.
The Last of Bart.
Stephen Rossi.
Have a good night.
And Christopher Morgan.
All of this has happened before. All of it will happen again.
All right.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time. Cheers.
Here's to you, Roland Bart.
To you, Roland and Bart.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals Discusses Philosophy, Narrative, and the Mechanics of Criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.